I learned three things the day my private airstrip became the center of a small town war. First, never underestimate a bored HOA president with too much time on her hands. Second, Montana winters are absolutely brutal without proper snow removal. And third, spite is a powerful motivator when you're dealing with people who think they can control your life. My name is Donovan, and I'm a commercial airline pilot who bought property in Ponderosa Heights, a gated development outside of Kalispell, Montana, specifically because it came with enough land to build a private airstrip. The previous owner had been a crop duster who'd gotten too old to fly, and he'd maintained a beautiful 2,800-foot grass runway on the property for 40 years. When I bought the place in 2023, that runway was the main selling point. I'm talking about a legitimate, FAA-registered private airstrip with proper lighting, windsocks, and everything a pilot could want. The property was gorgeous, sitting on 22 acres with mountain views that made every takeoff feel like something out of a postcard. The house itself was a sprawling log cabin-style home with 4 bedrooms, and the hangar could fit my Cessna 182 with room to spare. But here's the thing nobody mentioned during the sale. Ponderosa Heights had an HOA that was about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, except when it came to making residents miserable. I'd been living there for about 18 months when I decided to extend the runway. See, I'd been saving up for a bigger plane, a used Cirrus SR-22 that would let me take longer trips and fly in more diverse conditions. The problem was that the Cirrus needed at least 3,400 feet of runway for safe operations, especially at our altitude. I had the land, I had the money, and I had all my ducks in a row with the FAA, the county, and even the State Aviation Board. That's when I met Regina Gunderson. Regina was the HOA president, a 52-year-old woman with a blonde bob that looked like it hadn't changed since 1987, and a personality that could curdle milk at 50 paces. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a bumper sticker that said, "I speak fluent sarcasm," which should have been my first warning sign. Regina had been HOA president for 6 years, which in retrospect explained why half the houses in the development had "for sale" signs that never seemed to move. I first encountered her at a mandatory HOA meeting in February 2024. These meetings happened every month in the community center, a bland beige building that smelled like old coffee and disappointment. There were about 30 homes in Ponderosa Heights, though only about 15 residents showed up regularly to meetings. Most people had learned to avoid Regina's wrath by staying under the radar. "Item 7 on the agenda," Regina announced, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Donovan has submitted a proposal to extend his private runway. I'm recommending the board deny this request. I sat up straighter in my metal folding chair. "Excuse me, I haven't even presented the proposal yet." Regina's smile was thin and cold. "I've reviewed your paperwork. You want to add 600 feet to your runway, which would bring your flight path even closer to other homes in the development. The nearest home is still over 1,200 feet away," I countered, pulling out my survey maps. "I've had noise studies done. I've met with the county. Everything is above board and legal. The HOA covenants don't prohibit runway expansions. The covenants state that no exterior modifications can be made that negatively impact property values or quality of life for other residents," Regina shot back. She held up a bound document that looked like she'd been preparing for this fight. "Your increased air traffic will create noise pollution and safety concerns. I fly maybe 3 times a week, 4 at most. That's hardly increased air traffic. You fly now. What happens when you get a bigger plane? What happens when you start renting out your runway to other pilots? This is a residential community, not a regional airport. The thing was, I could see a few other residents nodding along with her. These were people who'd probably never set foot near my property, who had no idea what a small private plane actually sounded like compared to, say, a lawnmower or a snowmobile. But Regina had a way of making everything sound like an impending disaster. The vote was 8-2 against my proposal. I was stunned. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing up. "You can't just deny something because you feel like it. I have legal rights as a property owner." "You have legal rights within the framework of the HOA covenants you signed when you purchased your home," Regina replied smoothly. "If you disagree with this decision, you're welcome to pursue legal remedies. But until then, the board's decision stands. No runway extension." I left that meeting furious. The next day, I called a lawyer specializing in property rights and HOA disputes. Her name was Patricia Moore, and she had an office in downtown Kalispell. "Here's the thing," Patricia explained after reviewing my documents. "The HOA covenants are vague enough that they could argue your runway extension impacts property values. But they're also specific enough that they don't explicitly prohibit it. You could fight this. How long would that take? Probably a year, maybe more. You'd need to file an injunction, go through mediation, possibly end up in court. We're talking about $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, minimum." I felt my stomach drop. "Are you serious? HOA disputes are expensive and time-consuming. That's why most people either comply or move. I'm sorry, but that's the reality." I spent the next few weeks in a fog of anger and frustration. I'd bought this property specifically for the airstrip. I'd paid a premium for it. And now some busybody with a power complex was telling me I couldn't improve my own land, even though I'd followed every legal requirement. Then March rolled around, and Montana got hit with one of those late-season blizzards that remind you winter isn't done with you yet. We got 36 inches of snow in 72 hours. The entire development was buried. Now, here's something important about Ponderosa Heights. The development had one road in and out, a private drive called Ponderosa Loop that connected to Highway 93. The HOA was responsible for maintaining that road, which meant plowing it during the winter. But the HOA had never actually hired a professional snow removal company. Why would they, when they had me? See, when I'd moved in, the previous HOA president, a retired school teacher named Frank who'd since moved to Arizona, had approached me with a proposition. I owned a heavy-duty pickup truck with a commercial-grade snow plow attachment. I'd bought it specifically because Montana winters were no joke, and I needed to keep my runway and driveway clear for emergencies. Frank had asked if I'd be willing to plow Ponderosa Loop during winter storms in exchange for a reduction in my HOA dues. It had seemed like a good deal at the time. I'd save about $800 a year on dues, and plowing the road gave me something useful to do during storms. The road was about 2 miles long, making a loop through the development, and it usually took me 3 or 4 hours to clear it properly after a major storm. I'd been doing it for a year and a half without any issues. But after Regina and her board denied my runway extension, I found myself reconsidering that arrangement. The morning after the blizzard stopped, my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. It was Regina. "Derek, the road needs to be plowed. People can't get out." I looked out my window at the massive snowdrifts. "Good morning to you too, Regina. This isn't a social call. When are you planning to plow?" I sipped my coffee slowly. "I'm not." There was a long pause. "What do you mean you're not?" "I mean I'm not plowing the road anymore. I'm withdrawing from our informal agreement." "You can't do that. People need to get to work. Then the HOA should hire a professional snow removal service. That's what HOA dues are supposed to cover anyway. Regina's voice went up an octave. We have an agreement. We had an agreement. But after the board denied my runway extension for completely arbitrary reasons, I've decided I don't want to continue providing services to an organization that actively works against me. You're welcome to hire someone else. This is incredibly childish and irresponsible. No, what's childish is denying a legitimate property improvement out of spite. What's irresponsible is running an HOA that doesn't have a proper snow removal contract in place. I'll still plow my own driveway and runway access. The rest is your problem. I hung up before she could respond. It felt better than it probably should have. Within an hour, my phone was blowing up with calls and texts from other residents. Some were angry, demanding to know why I was holding them hostage. Others were confused, asking what had happened. A few understood and were sympathetic, but they still needed to get out for work or doctor's appointments. I felt a little guilty about those last ones, but I also knew this wasn't sustainable. The HOA couldn't function properly if it was relying on unpaid volunteer labor for critical services, while simultaneously preventing residents from using their own property. By noon, Regina had sent out a mass email to all residents explaining that I was refusing to plow due to a personal disagreement with the board. She made it sound like I was throwing a tantrum over nothing. The email didn't mention anything about my runway extension or why the board had denied it. I responded with my own email, laying out the facts. I'd submitted a proper proposal for a runway extension, complete with FAA approval, county permits, noise studies, and safety documentation. The board had denied it based on vague concerns about property values with no actual evidence. I explained that I'd been providing snow removal services voluntarily at a reduced rate, but I was no longer willing to donate my time and equipment to an organization that worked against my legitimate property rights. That email split the community right down the middle. Some people understood where I was coming from. A guy named Tom Pritchard, who lived 3 houses down, sent me a message saying he'd had his own run-ins with Regina over wanting to add a workshop to his garage. A woman named Susan Chen said the HOA had forced her to remove solar panels from her roof because they were visually unappealing. There were others too, residents who'd been quietly frustrated with Regina's dictatorial management style, but had never felt like they could speak up. But there were also plenty of people who thought I was being selfish and petty. They argued that whatever dispute I had with the HOA shouldn't affect everyone else's ability to get in and out of the neighborhood. One guy, Michael Sheffield, even posted on the community Facebook page calling me a spoiled pilot man-child who was endangering people's safety. The thing was, I wasn't actually endangering anyone's safety. This wasn't a blizzard where people would freeze to death if they couldn't evacuate. The storm had passed, the weather was clear, and anyone with a true emergency could call 911. The fire department and ambulances had access to the development through a maintenance gate that was kept clear. People just couldn't drive their regular cars out without the road being plowed. Regina tried to hire an emergency snow removal service, but it turned out that wasn't so easy. Most companies in the area were already under contract with other developments or businesses. The few that had availability wanted premium rates for emergency service, especially for a 2-mile private road that wasn't on their regular route. One company quoted $2,400 for a single plowing, which would completely blow the HOA's monthly maintenance budget. By the end of day 2, Regina was desperate. She called me again, this time with a different approach. Derek, let's be reasonable about this. What would it take for you to plow the road just this once, and then we can discuss a more permanent solution? Approve my runway extension. I can't just unilaterally reverse a board decision. Then call an emergency meeting and hold a new vote. You pushed this through last month with minimal discussion and no real evidence that my extension would harm anyone. Give me a fair hearing. The next regular meeting isn't until next week. You can call a special meeting with 48 hours notice. It's in the bylaws, I checked. Regina made a frustrated sound. Fine, I'll call a meeting for Friday evening. Will you plow the road before then? Nope. Plow the road after you approve my extension. That's extortion. No, that's consequences. You wanted to flex your authority, now you get to deal with the fallout. See you Friday. I hung up again. I was probably burning bridges, but at this point, I didn't care. I tried to play by the rules, and the rules had screwed me over. Wednesday and Thursday were chaos. The snow had settled and compacted, making it even harder to drive through. Some residents with four-wheel drive trucks managed to get out by driving very slowly and carefully, but most people were stuck. The community Facebook page was a war zone of arguments and accusations. Regina tried to organize a manual snow shoveling effort, which was completely impractical for a 2-mile road, and only 3 people showed up anyway. I spent those days maintaining my own property. I plowed my driveway, cleared my hangar access, and even did a full clearing of my runway just to prove a point. My Cessna sat in the hangar, ready to go if I needed to fly anywhere. I could get out just fine. Everyone else was stuck. On Thursday afternoon, I got a visit from the Flathead County Sheriff's Office. A deputy named Martinez pulled up in his SUV and knocked on my door. Mr. Donovan, I'm Deputy Martinez. I need to talk to you about the snow situation. I invited him in and offered him coffee, which he accepted. We sat in my living room, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the mountains. Nice place, Martinez said. I hear you're a pilot. That's right. Commercial airlines mostly, but I fly private for fun. Must be nice. Look, I'm here because we've gotten about a dozen calls from residents in this development complaining that you're refusing to plow the road. One woman, Regina something, suggested that you might be violating some kind of ordinance or agreement. I explained the situation to him carefully, showing him the documentation about my runway extension proposal, the HOA's denial, and the history of my voluntary snow removal arrangement. Martinez listened patiently, then nodded. Okay, so here's the thing. From a legal standpoint, you haven't done anything wrong. This is a private road maintained by a private HOA. You're not under any legal obligation to plow it, and there's no emergency situation that would require intervention. People are inconvenienced, but nobody's in danger. That's what I figured, but I wanted to make sure. That said, Martinez continued, this situation is creating a lot of tension. If things escalate, if someone gets hurt trying to navigate the unplowed road, or if there's property damage, it could become a bigger legal issue. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong, but I'd encourage you to try to work this out with your HOA sooner rather than later. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. Good. Hopefully, you can reach some kind of resolution. Martinez stood up and shook my hand. For what it's worth, I dealt with an HOA at my last place. Absolute nightmare. They tried to fine me for parking my patrol car in my own driveway, said it violated some aesthetic standard. What did you do? Moved to a place without an HOA. Best decision I ever made. After Martinez left, I felt a little better. At least I wasn't breaking any laws, but I also knew that the meeting the next day was going to be intense. Friday evening came, and I drove my truck through my cleared driveway out to the main road. then entered the development through the maintenance gate to get to the community center. The main entrance was still buried under snow, with deep drifts across Ponderosa Loop. I could see tire tracks where some brave souls had tried to force their way through with varying degrees of success. The community center parking lot had been partially cleared by some residents with shovels, just enough to fit about 10 cars. When I walked inside, the room was packed. Nearly every resident was there, faces ranging from angry to exhausted to curious. Regina sat at the head table with the other board members. Vice President Linda Hutchins, Treasurer George Marsh, and Secretary Diane Young. Regina's expression was tight and controlled, but I could see the stress around her eyes. "Let's call this special meeting to order," Regina announced. "We're here to reconsider Derek Donovan's proposal for a runway extension on his property. Derek, would you like to present your case?" I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation on my laptop, which I connected to the community center's projector. "Thanks for meeting on short notice," I began. "I know everyone's frustrated about the road situation, and I want to address that, but first, I want to make sure everyone understands what we're actually discussing here." I clicked through my slides, showing the survey maps of my property, the current runway configuration, and the proposed extension. I explained that the extension would add 600 feet to the existing runway, running lengthwise along my property in a direction that kept it even further from neighboring homes than the current runway. "I've already received FAA approval for this extension," I continued, showing the official documentation. "I've also received county permits for the grading and construction work. I commissioned a noise study from an independent acoustic engineering firm, and their findings show that the additional noise impact on neighboring properties would be negligible, less than 3 decibels, which is below the threshold of human perception." I pulled up the noise study charts. For context, a normal conversation is about 60 decibels. A lawnmower is about 90. My Cessna at takeoff is about 85 decibels at 100 feet, dropping to about 65 at 1,200 feet, which is the distance to the nearest home. The Cirrus I'm planning to buy is actually slightly quieter. "But you'll be flying more often," someone called out. "Actually, no. I'll be flying the same amount. The bigger plane just gives me more range and capability. I'm not running a commercial operation here. This is purely for personal use." I clicked to the next slide, which showed property value data. I also hired a real estate appraiser to assess potential impact on property values. Their conclusion was that a well-maintained private airstrip typically has either a neutral or slightly positive impact on nearby property values, especially in Montana, where private aviation is fairly common. Some buyers see it as a desirable amenity. Regina interrupted. "That's one appraiser's opinion. I could probably find an appraiser who says the opposite." "Maybe, but the burden of proof should be on the HOA to show actual harm, not on me to prove a negative. I've provided extensive documentation showing this extension is safe, legal, and minimally impactful." "What evidence has the board provided to justify denying my request?" Regina shuffled her papers. "The board's concern is about setting precedent. If we allow this, what's to stop other residents from making major modifications that could impact the community?" "The same thing that stops them now: the covenants, common sense, and proper review processes. Each proposal should be evaluated on its own merits. You can't deny my legitimate request just because you're worried about hypothetical future requests." Tom Pritchard stood up. "I'd like to say something. I've been in this development for 8 years, and I've seen Regina deny requests for all kinds of reasonable improvements. She denied my workshop because she said it was too large, even though it met all size restrictions in the covenants. She denied Susan's solar panels because she personally thinks they're ugly. She denied Bob Henderson's fence even though his property backs up to Forest Service land where elk were destroying his garden. "Tom, this isn't about past decisions," Regina said, her face reddening. "Actually, it is. It's about a pattern of Regina treating the HOA like her personal fiefdom where she gets to decide what she likes and doesn't like, rather than following the actual rules. I'm voting to approve Derek's runway extension." Susan Chen stood up next. "I agree. I'm tired of the board, specifically Regina, blocking everything based on personal preference rather than actual covenant violations or evidence of harm. Derek has done everything right. He's followed every rule, gotten every permit, and provided documentation supporting his project. What more do you want?" The meeting devolved into a debate that lasted 2 hours. People argued about property rights versus community standards, about whether the HOA should have broad discretionary power or should stick strictly to covenant enforcement, about whether I was being unreasonable for refusing to plow the road. Finally, Regina called for a vote. "All board members in favor of approving Derek's runway extension." Linda Hutchins raised her hand. "I vote to approve. I think he's met the burden of proof." George Marsh hesitated, then raised his hand too. "Approved. We need to be consistent with how we apply the covenants." Deanne Young looked at Regina, then at me, then back at Regina. She raised her hand. "Approved." Regina sat in silence for a long moment. Every eye in the room was on her. Finally, she spoke. "I vote to deny. The motion passes 3-1. Derek, your runway extension is approved." The room erupted in conversation. Some people clapped, others grumbled. Regina looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "Now," Regina said loudly, trying to regain control, "about the snow removal situation." "I'll have the road plowed by tomorrow morning," I said. "And I'm willing to continue providing snow removal for the rest of this winter season. But after that, the HOA needs to either hire a professional service or negotiate a proper, formal contract with me that includes fair compensation. I'm not working for reduced dues anymore." "How much are you asking?" George asked. "Market rate. I've gotten quotes from 3 other services, and the average is about $300 per plowing for a road this size. I'd be willing to do it for $250 since I'm already on site, but I want a written contract that specifies I'm an independent contractor, and I want the HOA to cover fuel costs." Regina looked furious, but George nodded. "That seems reasonable. We're paying about $3,000 a year in reduced dues for your services. At $250 per plowing, we'd need more than 12 major storms before we're losing money compared to the current arrangement. We usually get 8 to 10 major storms requiring full plowing," Linda added. "So we'd actually save a little money and Derek gets properly compensated." "I'll draw up a contract," George said. "We can vote on it at next month's regular meeting." The meeting adjourned shortly after. People filed out, some stopping to shake my hand or pat my shoulder, others avoiding eye contact. Regina left quickly, her mouth set in a hard line. True to my word, I was out on Ponderosa Loop at 7 a.m. Saturday morning with my plow truck. The snow had compacted over the past few days, making it harder work than usual, but I had the road cleared by early afternoon. I felt the tension in the community ease almost immediately as people were finally able to come and go freely again. The next week was relatively quiet. I didn't hear from Regina at all, which was fine by me. George sent me a draft contract for snow removal services, which looked fair and professional. I signed it and sent it back, In April, I started construction on my runway extension. I hired a local excavation company to do the grading work, and I contracted with a specialized aviation construction firm out of Great Falls to handle the actual runway surface and lighting installation. The whole project took about 6 weeks. During that time, Regina drove by my property multiple times. I saw her white Lexus crawling along the road, her head craned to watch the construction equipment. She never stopped or said anything, but her presence was unmistakable. In late May, the extension was complete. I scheduled my final FAA inspection, which passed without any issues. My new runway was now 3,400 feet long, properly graded and lit, with updated windsocks and approach lighting. It was beautiful. I flew my Cessna down to Colorado to pick up my new Cirrus SR-22. The previous owner was a retired executive who'd kept it in immaculate condition. Flying it back to Montana was pure joy. The Cirrus was faster, more comfortable, and more capable than my old Cessna in every way. Landing it on my extended runway for the first time felt like vindication. I thought that was the end of the story. I was wrong. In June, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Regina had filed a formal complaint alleging that my runway extension violated multiple county codes and represented a safety hazard. She was demanding an investigation by the county building department and the FAA. I called Patricia Moore again. "This is harassment," I told her. "Everything was approved. Everything passed inspection. She's just angry that she lost." Unfortunately, Regina has the right to file complaints with regulatory agencies, Patricia said. "The good news is that since you actually did everything properly, these complaints won't go anywhere. The bad news is that you'll need to deal with investigators and potentially spend time responding to the allegations." She was right. Over the next month, I had visits from county building inspectors, county planning officials, and even an FAA safety inspector. Each time I provided my documentation, showed them the work, and demonstrated that everything was up to code. Each time they found no violations and closed the complaints, but it was exhausting and stressful. Every time my phone rang, I worried it was another agency calling to investigate another spurious complaint. Regina was using regulatory processes as weapons, trying to punish me for standing up to her. In July, things escalated. I came home from a 3-day trip to find that someone had driven across my runway, leaving deep tire ruts in the grass surface. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was absolutely a safety hazard. If I tried to land without seeing those ruts, my landing gear could have caught and caused a crash. I called the sheriff's office immediately. Deputy Martinez came out to take a report. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, photographing the damage. "Only one person with a motive," I said. "Regina Gunderson. She's been harassing me since I got my runway extension approved." "Can you prove it was her?" "No, but the tire tracks came from the direction of the development, not the highway." "Someone had to have come through my property deliberately." Martinez nodded. "I'll file the report and patrol by more frequently. You might want to consider installing security cameras." I took his advice. I spent the next weekend installing a comprehensive security system with cameras covering my driveway entrance, hangar, runway, and the main approaches to my property. If someone came back, I'd have video evidence. 3 weeks later, the cameras paid off. I was in Seattle for work when my phone buzzed with a motion alert at 2 a.m. Montana time. I opened the security app and watched in real time as a white Lexus SUV drove onto my property, circled around to my runway, and stopped. A figure got out, I couldn't make out details in the darkness and started spreading something across the runway surface. My heart pounded. I recorded the video feed and immediately called 911, giving them the Flathead County Dispatch. "This is Derek Donovan at 1847 Ponderosa Loop. Someone is trespassing on my property right now and vandalizing my private airstrip. I have live video. The vehicle matches the description of Regina Gunderson's SUV. She's the HOA president. She's been harassing me for months." The dispatcher confirmed deputies were on their way. I watched on my phone as the figure finished whatever they were doing and got back in the vehicle. The Lexus drove off toward the development just as I saw flashing lights approaching from the other direction. I caught a flight home first thing in the morning. When I arrived back at my property, Deputy Martinez was waiting for me along with another deputy I didn't recognize. "Mr. Donovan," Martinez greeted me. "We need to talk." He walked me down to my runway. In the daylight, I could see what had been spread across the surface: roofing nails. Hundreds, maybe thousands of roofing nails, scattered across a 100-foot section of my runway. If I'd landed without seeing them, they would have shredded my tires and potentially caused a catastrophic crash. "This is attempted destruction of an aircraft," I said quietly. "That's a federal crime." "We're aware," Martinez said. "We arrested Regina Gunderson this morning. She's been charged with criminal trespassing, criminal mischief, and reckless endangerment. The FAA has been notified, and they're considering federal charges as well." I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. "Did she admit to it?" "She claims she was trying to protect the community from your dangerous aviation activities. She said you were a risk to everyone's safety, and the HOA had a responsibility to take action." "By sabotaging my runway and potentially killing me," Martinez shook his head. "She doesn't seem to grasp the severity of what she did. Her lawyer is already talking about mental health issues and stress-related decision-making." The case moved forward through the summer. Regina was released on bail but was removed as HOA president by an emergency vote of the board. Linda Hutchins took over as interim president, and the entire atmosphere of the HOA changed almost overnight. Suddenly, reasonable proposals were being approved, residents were being treated like adults, and the organization actually functioned like it was supposed to. Regina's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't having it. The evidence was too clear: video footage, her own partial admission, physical evidence at the scene. In September, she pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for avoiding federal prosecution. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years probation, and was ordered to pay $12,000 in restitution for the damage to my runway and the cost of cleanup. The FAA also investigated and determined that Regina's actions constituted interference with civil aviation operations. They imposed a $25,000 civil penalty and issued a formal warning that any future interference would result in federal criminal prosecution. At the sentencing hearing, I gave a victim impact statement. I kept it brief. Regina Gunderson's actions weren't just about property damage or HOA disputes. She deliberately tried to cause an aircraft crash that could have killed me and potentially people on the ground. She did this because she couldn't handle losing control over someone else's legal use of their own property. I hope this sentence sends a message that abusing authority and endangering lives has real consequences. Regina didn't look at me during the statement. She stared at the defense table, her face blank. After the sentencing, several news outlets picked up the story. HOA president jailed for sabotaging residents' private runway made headlines in aviation magazines and local news. I gave a couple of interviews, mostly emphasizing the importance of HOA accountability and residents' property rights. The publicity had an unexpected side effect. Other people dealing with HOA disputes started reaching out to me. I heard horror stories about HOAs foreclosing on homes over minor violations, imposing absurd fines for trivial infractions, and generally making people's lives miserable. It made me realize how lucky I was that things hadn't gotten even worse. By October, life had returned to something resembling normal. My runway was fully repaired and operational. I flew regularly, taking advantage of Montana's beautiful fall weather. The new HOA leadership under Linda was reasonable and functional. They hired a professional snow removal service for the winter, which meant I could focus on my own property without worrying about the whole development. The community itself seemed to heal too. Without Regina's constant interference and drama, people were more relaxed and neighborly. Tom finished his workshop. Susan got new solar panels approved and installed. Other residents started making improvements they'd been putting off for years because they hadn't wanted to deal with Regina's scrutiny. In November, winter came early with a surprise snowstorm that dropped 18 inches overnight. I woke up to find Ponderosa Loop already being cleared by the new snow removal company the HOA had hired. It was strange not having to rush out with my plow truck, but also kind of nice. I cleared my own driveway and runway access, made some coffee and watched the sunrise over the mountains. My phone rang. It was Linda Hutchins. "Hey, Derek, I wanted to give you a heads up. We're planning a community meeting next month to discuss updating the HOA covenants. We want to add some clearer language about property rights, approval processes, and limits on board authority. Would you be willing to serve on the revision committee?" I thought about it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with HOA business ever again. But another part of me recognized that this was an opportunity to help prevent future situations like mine. "Sure," I said. "I'll do it." "Great. And Derek, thanks for standing your ground. I know it was hard and things got crazy for a while, but you were right. Regina needed to be stopped, and if you'd backed down, she'd still be making everyone miserable." After we hung up, I sat on my porch with my coffee and thought about everything that had happened. It had been a wild year. I'd gone from excited new homeowner to HOA enemy number one to victim of a federal crime, all because I wanted to extend my runway. But through it all, I'd learned some valuable lessons. First, never underestimate the damage that one person with unchecked authority and a vindictive streak can do. Second, documentation and following proper procedures matters, especially when dealing with bureaucracies and legal disputes. Third, sometimes standing up for yourself means weathering a storm before things get better. I'd also learned that most people are reasonable when given the chance. The other board members who'd initially voted against my extension had changed their minds when presented with facts and proper arguments. Most residents had supported me once they understood what was really happening. Even the sheriff's department and prosecutors had taken the situation seriously and held Regina accountable. In December, I flew my Cirrus down to Utah for a ski trip with some college friends. The plane performed beautifully, and the extended runway made every takeoff and landing smooth and safe. As I climbed out over the Montana mountains on the way home, with the late afternoon sun painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and orange, I felt grateful for everything I'd fought for. My runway extension was exactly what I'd planned. 3,400 feet of perfectly graded, properly lit private runway that let me fly the plane I wanted from the property I'd chosen. It had cost me more than just money. It had cost me time, stress, and peace of mind for several months. But it was worth it. I contacted the previous owner, the retired crop duster, to tell him what had happened. He laughed when I told him about Regina and the nail incident. I dealt with her too, he admitted. That's part of why I moved. She tried to make me shut down the runway entirely, said it was a liability for the HOA. I told her to pound sand, since my airstrip predated the development by 20 years and was grandfathered in. She made my last few years there pretty unpleasant, though. Why didn't you warn me when I bought the place? Would you have believed me? Besides, I figured maybe she'd mellowed out. Guess I was wrong. She's in jail now, so I guess the problem solved itself. Good. Some people shouldn't have authority over anyone, let alone a whole community. As winter deepened, I settled into a comfortable routine. I flew when weather permitted, worked my airline schedule, and participated in the Covenant Revision Committee meetings. We made good progress on updating the HOA rules to include clearer standards for approving property modifications, stricter limits on board discretion, and better dispute resolution procedures. In February 2025, almost exactly a year after Regina had first denied my runway extension, we held a community vote on the revised covenants. They passed with 85% approval. At the meeting afterward, Tom Pritchard raised his glass of cheap wine in a toast to Derek for being stubborn enough to fix what was broken. I wasn't trying to fix anything, I protested. I just wanted to extend my runway. Same difference, Susan said. You stood up to a bully and the rest of us benefited. I thought about that later as I drove home through fresh snow. Maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes doing what's right for yourself ends up being right for everyone else too. My Cirrus sat in its hangar, ready for my next flight. My runway stretched out behind my house, cleared of snow and operational. The mountains rose in the distance, majestic and unchanging. I'd bought this property for the freedom to fly, for the independence of having my own private airstrip, for the joy of living in one of the most beautiful places on Earth. No HOA president, no matter how petty or vindictive, was going to take that away from me. I'd fought for my rights, weathered the consequences, and come out the other side with my runway extended, my property intact, and my community better for the struggle. Regina was serving her sentence, learning the hard way that authority comes with responsibility, and that there are consequences for abusing power. As for me, I was just a pilot with a private runway in Montana, living exactly the life I'd planned. And if the road needed plowing, well, that was someone else's problem now. The HOA had learned its lesson about respecting property rights and following its own rules. The community had learned the importance of accountability and standing up to abuse of authority. And I'd learned that sometimes you have to be willing to let everything get worse before it can get better. It was a hard lesson, but a valuable one. And every time I took off from my extended runway, climbing into the vast Montana sky with nothing but possibility ahead of me, I was reminded that fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult and inconvenient and costly, is always worth it in the end. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, revealing the brown grass that would soon turn green. I started planning summer flying trips, big cross-country adventures that my new plane made possible. I reconnected with old friends from flight school, made plans with family, and generally looked forward to the future. The Ponderosa Heights community continued to thrive under new leadership. Property values actually increased, partly because word got around that the HOA was no longer run by a tyrant. Several new families moved in, and I made sure to welcome them properly and explain the history so they understood what they were getting into. Regina was released early from jail in August for good behavior, having served about 11 months. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved out of state to live with her sister in Idaho. She never returned to Ponderosa Heights. Her house sold quickly to a young couple with 2 kids who were thrilled to be near the mountains. I never saw her again, and I was fine with that. Looking back now, the whole situation seems almost surreal. It's hard to believe that someone would go to such extremes over an HOA dispute, that a simple runway extension could spiral into criminal charges and jail time. But it happened, and it taught me more about human nature, power dynamics, and property rights than any book or class ever could. The most important thing I learned is this: you have to be willing to stand up for yourself, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it causes conflict, even when it would be easier to just give in and move on. Because if you don't stand up for your rights, nobody else will do it for you. My runway extension stands as a monument to that principle. Every time I see it, every time I use it, I'm reminded of what it took to make it happen. Not just the money and the construction work, but the arguments and the stress and the willingness to say no when everyone wanted me to say yes. I'm proud of that runway. Not just because it's useful or because it lets me fly bigger planes, but because it represents something bigger. The idea that homeowners have rights, that authority figures can be challenged, and that doing the right thing sometimes means being unpopular for a while. As I sit here now, writing this all down, I can see my runway out the window. The evening light is painting the mountains purple and gold, and a light breeze is making the windsocks dance. My Cirrus is fueled and ready in the hangar. Tomorrow, I'm flying down to Wyoming to visit a friend, then over to the Dakotas just because I can. That's freedom. That's what I fought for. And that's why, despite everything that happened, despite the stress and the conflict and the drama, I do it all again in a heartbeat. Because in the end, I won. Not because Regina went to jail or because the HOA leadership changed, but because I got what I set out to get. A longer runway on my own property that lets me fly the plane I want to fly. Everything else was just the price of admission. And honestly, it was worth every penny.